I'm Michael Callahan.
And I'm Gerd Stern.
I think my background in technology started at an early age. I was fascinated by looking in the back of a radio and seeing the tubes glowing. And I was always interested in how things worked. Around 1961, I got involved in what was to become the San Francisco Tape Music Center with Ramon Sendero, Morton Subotnick, Pauline Oliveros, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, Tony Martin, and John Cage and David Tudor. We rented space ultimately on Visadero Street, which was very nice. It had two large studios. One we rented to KPFA, the Pacifica station, the other to Anna Halprin's dance company, and then the tape center had the top floor, so this was kind of a one-stop shop.
I was born in the Saar Basin, which is right on the border of Germany and France. We were refugees from Hitler, and we arrived April Fool's Day in 1936 in New York. We started out living with relatives in the Bronx and eventually moved to Washington Heights. When I was in my teens, the first woman I ever lived with, I wrote something to her and gave it to her, and she said, "You're a poet." I was amazed because I hadn't thought of that at all, but it stuck. I became involved in the avant-garde in the San Francisco Bay Area and have been involved in it ever since, really.
In 1963, Gerd, who I hadn't met yet, was having a one-person show at the San Francisco Museum, and George Culler, the director, had offered Gerd the use of the auditorium for a fundraising, probably thinking, poor George, that Gerd would do a poetry reading or something, but instead was a very elaborate production called Who Are You and What's Happening, which had sounds, 16 people, a panel of sociologists. There were also slides showing the early verbal American landscape slides, a number of which had been taken by Stuart Brand. Gerd had approached the tape center for technical assistance, and that's how I met Gerd. I think the only thing I could say about my career is I've been willing to do it whether I knew how or not, and particularly in the tape center where things were the avant-garde, there weren't that many rules. We were also interested in information overload, so the early performances were an attempt to bring this to public consciousness that we were being bombarded with information. And we attempted to illustrate that with slide projectors and maybe a couple of film projectors and 3 or 4 speakers all playing at once. It broke into feedback, just this marble auditorium. I believe the review was Alfred Frankenstein, the Chronicle. Some horrendous eggs have been laid in the public halls of San Francisco in my day, but none to score somewhat of a success. It was overambitious, I don't know.
That was very funny because it made me feel like Stravinsky with the Rites of Spring scandal, because here's this scandal, but we had full audiences the 2 nights that we did this.
It had that potential of expanding consciousness very much, because consciousness and expanding consciousness was a hot topic. The multiplicity of images and sounds that we were using conceivably would require raising consciousness a little to take it all in.
When you get 3 things in a sequence and you realize that they have a certain kind of meaningful input or output, you can think of them as an aha. It's a recognized component of psychological insight.
Media, the word media was not in common use. Also, television was basically 10 or 12 years old. The effect was not really being discussed or analyzed except by Marshall McLuhan. How, particularly on patterns of human association, how the electric media was going to dictate a new social order.
It's a question of prophecy, because what we saw, Michael and I, very clearly, was that Marshall McLuhan was prophesizing something which turned out to be 50 or 60 years ahead of him, but he understood what was going to happen. Now, the biblical prophets wanted things to be right now, but here he was 50 to 60 years ahead of it. Right now, I think if we think of things 10, 15, 20 years, that's the most. We don't see 50 or 60 years what's going to be. And that's amazing, because through history, the timing of prophecy has changed. The person who was in charge of the gallery at British Columbia had been at our performance in San Francisco. Synchronistically, he said, I noticed that you had quoted Marshall McLuhan. I said, yeah, because John Cage and MC Richards had introduced us to his work. He said, he'll be there, so can you come up? And we piled everything into the Volkswagen Bug and drove up from San Francisco to British Columbia. And he said he would show anything that we could bring. We managed to load up most of the stuff that we had done together, and we had a show in British Columbia, as well as doing a multimedia piece. Ananda Coomaraswamy, who was a historian, wrote about the artists in traditional societies who did not sign things and considered themselves as people like any other laborer. That seemed like wonderful to me. So the idea of the company of us, or USCO, was not to sign things, but to attribute them to the company of us, and called USCO. I explained that concept to the painter Steve Durkee, who was living at an old church, 100 years old, in Garnerville, New York, which they had occupied as a studio after being in New York City. I explained how Michael and I had been working together in California, and Steve really wanted to get involved in this. He said, why don't we send for Michael to come? I said, I don't know if Michael wants to leave California, but he did, and he arrived, and that was the beginning of USCO, which started out as 3 people and wound up later at 15 and 20, all kinds of people involved, engineers, poets, artists, photographers, people who did presentations all over the United States and globally eventually.
We didn't have any interest at that point in tightly programming.
Yeah, we were pretty loose.
Yeah, there were themes. I mean, there might be people, there might be abstracts, maybe 5 or 10 slides on a theme, but exactly how these are going to come up in these 4 or 5 images, how they're going to interact, how they're going to relate is not known yet and will be unique. It's not repeatable because nothing is synchronous. Technically, it would have been difficult to really precisely control things back in the mid-'60s, which was just as well because we didn't have really any interest in it. It's a performance. It's a performance as opposed to recording. It's hard to imagine today the scarcity of equipment, like trying to get 2 decent tape recorders in the same room at the same time was a challenge. So we had to make maximum use of the available technology. Kodak introduced the slide projectors with a rotary tray around 1964, and we were able to acquire 4 of those. I built a controller to flash the lamps and change the slides to give it some more effects. I found it quite beautiful, the multiple images. In Kingston, New York, there was P&D surplus. Virtually all the computers out there were on lease, so IBM would call the old ones in to make room for the new ones, and they would wind up at P&D surplus. That's where we got the parts.
Michael had a specialty of quoting how expensive the parts we would buy for a few dollars. They were thousands of dollars. Yeah. And he would say, we got it, you know, for $10 or $15. Yeah. And it was amazing.
You know, we might initially shape the tools that we use, but thereafter the tools shape us.
We grew up totally in the analog world, and we have an affection for it.
Maybe the world is digital, but the force is analog.
That's great, man. That's a good line. You better remember that.
Ma